Mr. Marshall, somewhere in my dim recesses of memory, I think I came upon a statistic that said that a vast proportion of the weight of the Earth is actually accounted for by insects.
Absolutely.
And that is so striking, so astonishing. I take it all of it happening sort of underground, that it gave me the inspiration to search you out and to see whether you could corroborate that fact and tell us more about this fascinating world where, by the way, sexual cannibalism is a common practice, and the fate of the male is not worth discussing. So before I leave you to the tender mercies of Stephen Marshall, I want to read this one quote. It's easy to forget that human beings form a tiny, two-legged minority in an overwhelmingly six-legged world. Stephen Marshall.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to talk about sexual cannibalism, but there are some pretty cool bugs in which the males are consumed by the females right after mating, but we're not going to go there. Let me start just by pointing out that this is a digital photograph. I just took it a couple of weeks ago. It's just a field photograph, but it shows all of the attributes of this species in enough detail so that a specialist in this group of flies can look at it and identify it to species. And in fact, the photograph is going to be used in a guide to species in this group of flies shortly. I tell you that not because it's remarkable or that this photo is a remarkable accomplishment, but quite the opposite. It's completely unremarkable. And that is really exciting because digital photography has just come into the reach of everyone and anyone in recent years, and it's leading a revolution in the study of biodiversity and in our access to information about biodiversity. And that should concern or interest everybody, since, of course, our species is suspended in the web of life. And the threads of the web of life, of course, are our species, and that's biodiversity. The threads cover the planet in more or less these proportions. I've divided the planet up here according to the number of known or described species of plants, animals, and other organisms. And you'll see that the planet is primarily covered with insects. We've got about 1.7 million known species on the planet. That's what we know about biodiversity, species diversity. Over 1 million are insects. This summary, though, shortchanges us a little bit because there are two real problems with the picture you see here. One is that of these 1.7 million species, we can only reasonably identify a very small fraction. So if we look at the 1 million insects, most biologists could probably only identify 1, 2, 3%. The rest of these known, named, described species are almost hidden behind locked doors that can only be opened by a few specialists with the right keys. So this is one problem, the identification barrier to understanding biodiversity. And that's where digital photography is really causing a revolution, and it's really what I want to talk about today. But first of all, I need to talk a bit about the other issue. The other problem in biodiversity, and this is the one you're probably more familiar with, is that the 1.7 million species that we know of that have names that are described is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole pile of other species that we haven't discovered that don't have names. Scientists argue about how many. Entomologists are always squabbling about whether there's 1 million or 10 million. I happen to think it's down in the 1 to 2 million range, and I think that most of them are small, obscure, or in poorly studied areas. But the fact remains that there's an enormous number of animals out there, of insects out there, that we haven't discovered yet, new to science. And that's really an exciting fact, and I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of people think that the key function of biodiversity scientists is to discover new species, because it is cool. These are new species. I took these two photographs last month in Bolivia, and they're brand new to science. I mean, you can't get any newer than that. They don't have names. I think that's really exciting. And I'm only able to recognize these as new species, of course, because I'm a taxonomist, and I became familiar with all of the species in this group, this family of flies. As a matter of fact, I became familiar with pretty well all the specimens are borrowed specimens from museums all over the world, and I collected these things throughout the range of the group, and poked and prodded them and looked at everything from molecules to morphology to work out phylogeny. I looked at fossil specimens, the whole ball of wax, which is what taxonomists do. I'm a taxonomist. To put together a kind of overview of this family, which will provide a context in which I can describe and name these two species in a way that they're available. They're part of the lexicon of science and available to biologists and indeed anybody in a correct evolutionary context. So that's what taxonomists do. It's revisionary taxonomy. Such an overview is called a revision, and revisions are the foundation of what we know about biodiversity. They're the building blocks on which biodiversity science stands. However, nobody's surprised that I'm finding new species in a place like Bolivia, but what about your backyard? If you head out in your backyard or, say, High Park, and you take a photograph, everybody's got a digital camera now. Pull it out of your shirt pocket, take a picture of this little fly. What are the odds that this is new to science, one of these exciting new discoveries, an unnamed species? If it's got a name, what are the odds that you can find that name and tap all the associated information about it? And if you can't, why not? And what's more to the point, if you can't do it now, then when will you be able to do it, and how will you be able to do it? And these are the points that I'm most interested in pursuing today. Some groups of insects are easily identified, and they have been for a long time. Butterflies, large moths, damselflies. These are things that anybody can identify with, same way you'd identify birds, binoculars, field guide. As a matter of fact, I call insects like this honorary birds. And one of my objectives is to make all insects honorary birds. But at the moment, there's only a small fraction of insects that are honorary birds. The rest of them are blocked by this identification barrier. And, well, what about the rest of them? I had a lot of time to consider that question as I was working on this book over the last few years. And I started this project with a big pile of notes on one side and a huge pile of slides on the other side. Slides, remember those things, little pieces of film and cardboard? Lots of images. And I wanted to take about 5,000 of those images and identify them to genus and species for use in this overview of eastern North American insects. My colleagues told me that that was impossible because conventional wisdom was, and to some extent still is, that identifying insects to genus and species requires specimens, microscopes, technical literature. Can't be done. Well, of course, I've been working in the University of Guelph insect collection for the past 25 years, and I knew that I could take specimens, and therefore probably slides, compare them to specimens in the collection, and identify them. This collection, by the way, is 150 years old. It's got 2 million specimens, about 1 million of which are identified to species and have locality and data labels on them. So tremendous resource to be able to use. And indeed, I was able to identify most of my photographs, especially those of common things, using this resource. But there were still some that couldn't be identified. And so I sent them out to specialists. There's not very many specialists in insect taxonomy or identification. I knew most of them. So I sent these things out with letters saying, have a look. If you recognize them, I'd like to know, but I don't really expect anything. I was shocked, well, pleasantly surprised and shocked, when these images started coming back to me from these specialists all over the world with species names on them. And I phoned up my friends, and I said, how did you do that? You shouldn't have been able to identify these just from images, but you did it. How did you do it? Can you tell me how to do it? And what's more important, do you think you could develop some sort of guide that would allow other people to identify these otherwise unidentifiable things in your area of expertise? And the response I got was invariably, yeah, it can be done, but it would be really expensive and technically difficult. I can't take all those photos. It would be really hard. And even if I did, there's no place that will publish that sort of photographic identification guide. Even if we really need it, it just can't be done. Well, I pondered those problems, and first problem, as I've already alluded, disappeared as I was pondering it. Digital photography came of age, and it's a revolution. I think the most important revolution in biodiversity since the invention of the microscope. So the photographs, the depictions of attributes of animals, not a barrier anymore. And the journal, the need for a place to publish this stuff, was not a problem either. It was an opportunity, and I went to the Biological Survey of Canada with this opportunity, and they saw it as a great opportunity as well, and they provided me with a blue ribbon editorial board and a little budget, a shoestring budget, and together we launched the Canadian Journal of Arthropod Identification, which is really quite important because it's a first conduit by which taxonomists, these specialists laboring away in obscurity, can disgorge the contents of their brains through the web and make it available to you. Very important concept. We launched this less than a year ago today with this little pilot project where we worked with the world expert on the scorpion flies, the order Mycoptera, and he's retired. An alarmingly high proportion of world experts on groups of organisms are retired. But we worked together to produce this very interactive, user-friendly guide by which anybody can click through to a species identification in this formerly obscure order. More importantly, putting up this little pilot project, it set an example, and it opened up a flood of contributions from across the country, not only from specialists, but also from naturalists and students, dealing with subjects as diverse as mites of Alberta or bees of eastern Canada. So we're starting to get all sorts of contributions in, and we're actually a little bit backlogged processing them for posting. Some of my own research group at University of Guelph started to produce tools that people could use to identify their groups. For example, one of my recent PhD students had revised this family of flies, a family that you've probably never heard of. He followed up in the wake of his revision by producing a key to the world genera and the world species and putting it in interactive format. So now anybody can go on the web if they've got one of these flies and just go click, click. Anybody can click on a few pictures, answer a few simple questions, and bang, they've got a species identification. And this is really important. This group was kind of interesting because along the way we discovered that the males defend pieces of territory, and they do so using all sorts of bizarre modifications. The previous slide showed a pair of males beating each other about the head and shoulders with their elbows. This one shows some males with broadened heads. These guys have head measuring competitions. And really, they stretch out their antenna to look as broad as possible, and the guy with the biggest head gets the girl. And if they have exactly the same size head, then they battle it out and fight for the territory. We're also trying to develop user-friendly guides to yellow jackets, hornets, paper wasps, and their relatives. And we've actually worked up a marvelous guide with some 700 photos that, again, anybody can click through and get to a species name for yellow jackets, hornets, and their relatives. Along the way, as we were working on this, we had occasion to survey all of the stinging wasps of Ontario. So we gathered up all the material, specimens from new inventories, new collections, old collections, and we found there was some 500 species of stinging wasps in Ontario. And hornets and yellow jackets are just one group of stinging wasps. What's remarkable about this, and this is one of the little take-home messages I want people to remember, is that of that 500 species, over 30% had never been recorded from Canada before. And the reason that we knew nothing effectively about our biodiversity, even in a large and important group like the stinging wasps, was this identification barrier. If somebody 10 years ago wanted to find out what stinging wasps are in a protected area or a park in Ontario, they just really couldn't do it. They'd have to find a wasp expert, a reference collection, a whole pile of technical literature. Couldn't do it. Identification barrier. So what we're doing with this digital photography revolution is eliminating that identification barrier, so future biologists and biologists from now on in will be able to identify these things, and also ourselves establishing a new baseline with a lot of new records. Some of these things are of immediate interest. The wasp shown across the top, for example, is a kind of wasp that stings beetles. It paralyzes the beetles, brings them back, and puts them underground in a nest, and it stores these paralyzed beetles for its larvae to develop on. And the species up there is actually one of the ones that we recorded new from Canada. We first found it in 2004. In 2005, I noticed that the beetles they were stocking their nests with belonged to the same group as a thing called the emerald ash borer, and they were bringing in hundreds and hundreds of these things. And since then, we've developed these wasps into a monitoring tool for monitoring emerald ash borers. Emerald ash borers are an invasive pest that are very, very difficult to monitor. So sometimes these can have unexpected practical applications. Now, this novelty rate, this stunning, staggering novelty rate that reflects this horrible identification barrier that we're addressing, occurs across the board. Grasshoppers, crickets, some beetles, everything we've looked at suffers from this identification barrier. Case in point, these are bee flies. Now, bee flies are really, really cool flies. They're pretty flies. You see them hovering over flowers. You see them hovering over the edge of the beach, when you're out to the lake shore. This one's hovering over some sand and then dipping down to a wasp burrow. And she's sticking her egg into the wasp burrow. Her egg will hatch, and her larva will then parasitize the wasp larva. So interesting biology, pretty flies. I thought this would be a nice, easy group to clean up for our new digital journal, so I assigned it to a student. We soon found that we had to bring in the world expert on the family, bee fly family, and we studied the bee flies of Ontario. We developed a beautiful, clickable identification guide that my 10-year-old can click through in 2 minutes and get species names on it. So we've dropped the identification barrier. But we moved the number of species in Ontario from 27 to 60, and relatively large, pretty, one would think, well-known flies. So we're seeing this phenomenon over and over and over, and I think it's really significant. Here's another group of flies called the flower flies. We have 284 species in Ontario now, unidentifiable. If any one of you wanted to identify these pretty flies right now, you'd have to do a lot of technical work through technical papers. That's crazy, because almost all of these are identifiable in 5 clicks or less from color photographs, from digital photographs that anybody can take. So I think we're leading a revolution in access to biodiversity information. Of course, I don't want to create the impression that all biodiversity is easily diagnosable in a few clicks yet. We'll get there. There are still several groups, like this one, big-headed flies. They're parasitic flies, where there's tons of new species. About 20% of the Ontario species in this family are undescribed, and probably 50% of the North American species are undescribed. This situation gets even more extreme when we go to tiny, tiny things like these little flies. I did a revision of this group of flies a couple of years ago. Ended up with 54 species. 52 of them were new to science. Obviously, we're not going to be doing digital identification guides to things like this. We're still working on species definition using all possible characters, molecular and morphological. It will be some years before we can then take the results and make them easily available to everybody by photographs. But we'll get there. And so the picture that I see emerging about North American biodiversity is we have a few honorary birds up there to the left. But that few, that 2 or 3%, is swiftly moving to 70, 80% as we move across the top there. And the other 20 to 30%, indicated by the images across the bottom, are smaller things, tropical things, or really small things where we still have a lot of primary work to do as taxonomists. And I guess if we need another take-home message, it's so many species, so little time. There may be somebody here who doesn't see the intrinsic importance of working out those threads in the web of life and the tremendous benefits to getting our diversity in hand. I mean, we don't know anything about Canadian biodiversity in a sense. We need to nail these things down. Well, everybody appreciates the importance of mosquitoes. So surely you can see that if we get a nice web guide to mosquitoes, and indeed we have had a paper submitted to our digital journal, Mosquitoes of Ontario, that this has got to be useful for naturalists and conservation biologists. Here's a species that only occurs on Walpole Island. It doesn't bite. It's easy to recognize by a picture. It's a beneficial species. Here's a genus of mosquitoes which you can identify in Ontario, 2 species, just the way you identify butterflies or moths, looking at the scales on the wings. But this is the deadliest genus of organisms on the planet. According to the World Health Organization, this genus kills a child in Africa every 30 seconds. This is Anopheles. It's the only genus that carries malaria. So very, very, and that, I mean, it's not a medical problem here in Ontario, but you can still see the immediate value of digital photography as identification devices. This is the Asian tiger mosquito. Lovely thing, isn't it? It's just recently been recorded from the southern fringe of Ontario, and it's instantly recognizable from photographs. So what a great benefit to have a free, web-accessible digital key to these things, as well as wasps and other flies. So thanks very much for your attention. Thanks very much.